This is the crowd, and you are now online.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Galen Charlton. I'm Implementation Manager at Equinox Software in the United States. I've been active in Koha for several years, and I'm very sorry that I'm not here with you all in Cordoba, but I hope you find my presentation useful. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to screen sharing to show my slides. As a bit of an organizational note, if you have questions, probably the best way to ask them is to ask them on the Koha IRC channel. And I know that at least one person in the audience is there right now. But without further ado, let me go, show my screen. And what I'm going to talk about is extending Koha using linked data. Of course, linked data is something that has been attracting a fair amount of attention in the library space, with efforts like expressing using linked data to express RDA records, with efforts like BibFrame by the U.S. Library of Congress, as well as projects within Koha itself, including the Oslo Public Library's upcoming implementation of Koha combined with a RDF triple store, as well as efforts that Catalyst in New Zealand have been making to implement Elasticsearch for Koha. So this is something that is an ongoing trend. But what I'm going to talk about and focus on for this presentation is what you can do right now. So, first off, for the past 50 or so years, electronic bibliographic metadata has been focused on a record-based view of the world. So you have a book in hand, you want to describe it, and if you look at this record that I have on the slide, it's a Mark 21 record for a children's book called There's an Owl in the Shower. But one way of viewing a MARC record is as a tagged document, because the MARC format had its origins in the 1960s. It's using numeric field labels and alphanumeric subfield labels. If it had been devised more recently, maybe all this tagging would have been coming over as XML. But the key thing is that for this edition, this record, in a further sense, falls kind of in between the work, expression, and manifestation at level, depending on which parts you pick and choose from. But it's it's something that, to a large degree, has to be considered as a piece. But with linked data, one of the things that's going on is that what we think of as a record can be broken down into a set of assertions. So this is the same record, or a portion of it, except this time run through the online BibFrame converter from MARC. And BibFrame is an ongoing and relatively recent project to establish a RDF-based vocabulary for bibliographic metadata. So if we look at this view of 4 triples from the RDF view of this record, it's making an assertion that for this particular identifier of the record, identifier, the bit with the http bibframe.org resources, so on, that it has it's making the assertions that okay, its extent is 134 pages. It has an illustration note. It has a title statement and a responsibility statement. Now, with this atomized view of the world, you can mix and match assertions. And as we'll see later on, if we were to take this example of Jean Craighead George as an author, we can map it to an identifier. But one of the challenges is that a record-centric, document-centric, mark-centric view of the world, and whether you are thinking in terms of Mark 21 or Unimark or any of the other national mark standards that are still out there, the assertion-based, linked data-based view of the world is a massive change and reconceptualization of our metadata. And, well, as we all know, change is hard. It's unpredictable. Even within the notion of all of the work going on defining vocabularies for library-linked data, we have several big contenders. We have the BibFrame vocabulary, we have RDA vocabularies, but although it is possible and to mix and match vocabularies, at the moment it's a little hard to predict what we will, as a global metadata community, or perhaps a set of smaller metadata communities, what vocabularies will settle on. And of course, it's expensive. Now, I don't need to tell you all that open source and free software are excellent ways to share the expense, but in our case, the expense isn't just the software. Everybody has a massive legacy of piles of MARC records that we don't want to just ditch and start over from the beginning. And of course, change is time-consuming. Libraries have been talking about various approaches for semantic web and linked data technologies as applied to library metadata, and that's been going on for probably roughly 6 or 7 years seriously, but it's going to take a while for the first fully triple store-based iOS and discovery service that's in common use by libraries, especially public libraries, to make its appearance. And of course, I mentioned piles and piles of MARC records. Well, one of our issues is that we librarians, as technologists, have consistently been too early adopters of technology. So, of course, we consider MARC. 1966, the Library of Congress made its first distribution of MARC records to its testing partners. 1969, a guy who worked for IBM invented the generalized markup language. About a decade later, there was a standardization effort for SGML. 2 decades later, XML became a recommendation of the World Wide Web Consortium. And a year later was the first RDF recommendation. And of course, around that time, Tim Berners-Lee, started, speaking in terms of his conceptualization, his thoughts about the semantic web. Or another quick example, INSIP as a protocol. And if Chris Cormack is in the audience, he's probably shaking his head sadly now. But SOAP as a web service protocol or meta protocol was submitted to W3C in 2000. Years later, the first version of INSIP was published. Then we have SOAP becoming a recommendation. And then, oopsie, JSON started becoming popular as a basis for web services. So this is another example where libraries wanted something that was better than SIP2, but they started work on standardizing INSIP well before people in other areas of computer programming were thinking in terms of relatively simple and easy to use web services the way that we expect nowadays. So, to reiterate a point, if by some magic libraries had been using card catalogs and book catalogs and microfilm catalogs until this year, and then decided to automate, if we were starting from scratch from the beginning, we wouldn't invent MARC. We would be looking for data formats, storage formats, and exchange formats that were less ambiguous, easier to parse, designed for sharing, designed to share changes in particular, and which had better and easier tools. But there's also a positive legacy that, well, we actually do, as library professionals, know something about metadata. And of course, we have a lot of it. So of course, one approach to coming to a linked data world would be to burn everything down, toss away our MARC records, and start building triple stores and redo all of our metadata. The people who hold the money bags wouldn't like that very much. And of course, in our community with an open source can-do attitude, well, there's no reason for us to wait for somebody to tell us how to solve our problems. We can take advantage of the various projects going on and use Koha as a prototyping system and avoid the proprietary vendor game of a library saying, please fix this problem or implement this new thing, and a vendor saying, okay, we'll do that if you pay us money and tell us exactly what you want. So again, this is why efforts like what the Oslo Public Libraries are doing are very important. Because what they're doing is going to turn out to be a proof of concept. Maybe they'll get it perfect, or at least good enough, or maybe we'll learn things about how to do linked data better. But the key thing is that this experimentation is going on now. Now, of course, we do have to keep in mind that the half-life of a MARC record is going to be measured in years, if not decades. And people can't necessarily wait forever for for a big global solution to take place. So this is where, for the average library who's using Koha or Evergreen or any other system, or even proprietary systems, that there's a way forward, and that's to embrace incremental change, take advantage of the fact that our tools for dealing with MARC records are getting better and better, oddly enough, even as MARC is entering its half-life, and let the authority records save us. Now, I should point out that the examples that it will be showing will be MARC 21 based. Some of the details will be different for Unimark users, and there are libraries, library communities, including the ones in Germany, who, if you look at it the right way, have already been taking advantage of linked data techniques in their MARC records already. So, Koha supports linking bibs to authority records. And what this means is that if we start from a heading for, say, Rallying JK, and in MARC 21 land normalize that heading, we can establish which authority record that comes from, and in turn plug in its identifier. So, and for certain, so if we show an example of a MARC 21 authority record, give me a moment while I see if I can zoom in a bit. Although actually I don't see anything obvious, so I'm not going to waste your time fiddling with Hangouts. But if we look at this example of an authority record for the American author Octavia Butler, we see in the 100 field the name heading, but we also see, in terms of identifiers, the Koha authority ID in the L1, number 35, and an OCLC identifier for the heading, and a Library of Congress identifier. And if this were linked in Koha, what you'll see in the 100 field in this bib record is a subfield 9 with the identifier 35. Now this 35 is an identifier that applies only to the local Koha database, and that per se isn't all that useful. In my catalog, name authority record 35 is Octavia Butler. For your record, it might be the authority record for Jorge Luis Borges. So what we need are global identifiers. So subfield 0 in MARC 21 was something that was added to it kind of at the insistence of the Germans, but this contains a global identifier to the Library of Congress authority record, the DLC N790566554. Now, this identifier as a string can be useful within the context of Koha, but if you turn it into an actionable URI, it becomes even more useful. So if we were to, for example, click on this link, because these name identifiers are globally resolvable, we'll see the more information about this heading, and we can use this ERI as an identifier in RDF assertions. So going back to the slides, so what does it mean? So what does it mean if we have this sort of identifier? Well, it means that we can take advantage of linking it to other sources. One of which is the Virtual International Authority file, which is a service that's run by the Library of Congress, or sorry, by OCLC, and includes contributions from a large number of libraries across the world, including National Library of Mexico, the British Library, the German National Library, the National Library of France, and so on. I notice that there aren't any contributors from South America, but hopefully that will come in time. But if we go back and look at this author again, what we see here is a global identifier, and from the interface, you can also see that there is more information that comes with this record, including links to some of the works written by Octavia Butler. So one of the things that the version that VIAF does is they have a web service where you can pass it an LC identifier or an identifier coming from any other national authority file that participates in VIAF, and get back the VIAF identifier. So, for example, this is taking the Library of Congress identifier, doing a search, and if we click on this and look at the results, and zoom in, we can go through it and see that, okay, here is an example of the VIAF identifier. Now, unfortunately, VIAF doesn't have a Sparkle endpoint yet, but you can get access to full data dumps of it. And this is an example of the bit that we're trying to get from this. So, having done this, we can go look at the RDF, and we notice that there are things here that we could potentially make use of in our catalog. For example, let's say that you wanted to search on the Japanese form of the name. A possibility would be, once you've established these links, to ingest them into Zebra. Now, this is something for which code would have to be written, but ingest them into Zebra and use it to supplement the keyword index. But if we jump back, another thing that interacting with linked data services like VIAF gives us is the ability to do things like pull in updates. So one of my bullet points is jokingly killing off dead authors. And by this I don't mean actually assassinating our authors, but when an author does die, to pull in information like the year of their death into our catalog. And as I had also mentioned previously, pulling in cross-references. And in the case of VF, they do have some information in their XML feed that isn't yet in their RDF feeds. And one of the possibilities is to do this enrichment automatically. So to recap, in the Koha database, we can go from bib heading to the authority record to the LC or other national control number of the authority record, to a service that maps it to a URI, then to VF, and bring back RDF that we can use to enrich data in the Koha catalog. And how can this enrichment take place? Well, things like adding links and displays in the discovery interface. And this can be done through code changes or by adding JavaScript. And even though you can change Koha's code, there are some applications where simply plugging something into the OPAC user JS system preference may be easier. So this is an example of some JavaScript that uses VF, and in this case it's in the staff interface, and what it's doing is adding auto suggest to the authority record lookup. And this is something that was done by a group in Italy, and full code is available in the Koha wiki. But the point is that this is a concrete example that's available right now of using a linked data tool in Koha, without having to wait for the atomization of the MARC record. So the upshot is, with tools like the VF autosuggest, the only excuse for not authorizing name headings or linking to names is time. So this sort of hybrid MARC / linked data catalog can exist now. We don't need to wait on BibFrame, a whole new iOS, or for everybody else to adopt linked data techniques. And we can also take advantage of techniques now without having to wait for things like the Oslo Public Library contributions to Koha to be finished. Although, of course, what they're doing, people should be paying attention to inform what what experimentation is appropriate now. So what do you need? A willingness to iterate, and this is where doing things like talking on the Koha mailing list and using the wiki to exchange ideas can be very helpful. Authority control, which Koha can support now, but in this case, what I mean is, if possible, bringing in authority records from the appropriate national union catalogs. Because one of the things about linked data approaches is that it makes authority control much more useful, not just for the purpose of implementing browser searching, which Koha has now, but to be able to exchange data with other systems. And as I mentioned, the hybrid can publish linked and structured data now. So, and one of the things I should mention is the schema.org markup that Dan Scott added in Koha 314, which can be used to if you let your Koha catalog be crawled by search engines such as Google, to indicate that you have items available, and hopefully increase the visibility of your library to the internet search engines. So, there are some existing tools available right now. The Kathmandu, RDF, and MARC projects are good to look at. I believe that they're also being used as part of the Elasticsearch integration. There's also an RFC for further linked data support in Koha, and tools to be forthcoming to use the linked data sources to enhance records in Koha. So I wanted to respect your time, because I know that there are other things scheduled at the conference for later today. So at this point, I would like to thank you for listening. And if you have questions, please either ask them in the Koha IRC channel or relay them to Tomas. Okay, well, I will also be tweeting a link to my slides, so follow the Koha iOS tag on Twitter. And if you have questions, you can feel free to tweet at me or send me an email. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Galen.
Thank you.